The old man walked slowly through the academy gardens, leaning on a staff of olive wood, watching young men argue about shadows. It was early autumn, and the light over Athens had that particular slant it took on only in these weeks, low, gold, generous with the world's flaws, as if trying to make up for the harshness it would bring in winter. Plato had learned, over 8 decades, to trust this light more than any other. It was the light in which things looked most like what they actually were. "Master," called a student, jogging to catch him, sandals slapping against the packed earth path. "They're asking again about the cave." Timon says if the prisoners were freed and shown the fire, they'd simply believe the fire was the new illusion and reject it too. He says the Republic assumes the freed man wants truth. He says most men only want a story that doesn't hurt. Plato smiled, the particular smile he wore when a student had accidentally said something true. "And what do you think, Demetrios?" "I think Timon is being difficult." "Timon is being honest. That is different." Plato lowered himself, joint by careful joint, onto a stone bench beneath a fig tree he had planted decades ago, when the tree and the academy were both saplings, both unlikely to survive their first winter. "Tell me, if you dragged a man from darkness into sunlight, and his eyes burned, and he wept, and cursed you, would you call that success?" Demetrios hesitated, the way good students always hesitated, weighing the trap before stepping into it. "I would call it necessary." "So would I, once." Plato looked toward the gate, where new students always entered, blinking at the inscription above it. "None may enter who has not studied geometry." He had written those words himself 40 years ago, with more confidence than he currently possessed about almost anything. "I wrote that a shadow watcher, once freed, would naturally desire the sun. I was young. I had not yet noticed how many men, given a choice between comfort and the sun, choose the wall. They build little houses against it. They decorate the shadows." The old man walked slowly through the academy gardens, leaning on a staff of olive wood, watching young men argue about shadows. It was early autumn, and the light over Athens had that particular slant it took on only in these weeks, low, gold, generous with the world's flaws, as if trying to make up for the harshness it would bring in winter. Plato had learned, over 8 decades, to trust this light more than any other. It was the light in which things looked most like what they actually were. "Master," called a student, jogging to catch him, sandals slapping against the packed earth path. "They're asking again about the cave." Timon says if the prisoners were freed and shown the fire, they'd simply believe the fire was the new illusion and reject it too. He says the Republic assumes the freed man wants truth. He says most men only want a story that doesn't hurt. Plato smiled, the particular smile he wore when a student had accidentally said something true. "And what do you think, Demetrios?" "I think Timon is being difficult." "Timon is being honest. That is different." Plato lowered himself, joint by careful joint, onto a stone bench beneath a fig tree he had planted decades ago, when the tree and the academy were both saplings, both unlikely to survive their first winter. "Tell me, if you dragged a man from darkness into sunlight, and his eyes burned, and he wept, and cursed you, would you call that success?" Demetrios hesitated, the way good students always hesitated, weighing the trap before stepping into it. "I would call it necessary." "So would I, once." Plato looked toward the gate, where new students always entered, blinking at the inscription above it. "None may enter who has not." "Then the whole allegory fails?" "No. It simply described something harder than I first understood." He did not explain further just then, because a memory had risen in him, uninvited, the way memories did more and more often these days, not summoned, simply arriving, fully formed, as though they had been waiting nearby the whole time. He was 19 again, in the Agora, and Socrates was talking to a bronze myth about courage. The bronze-smith had said something confident and wrong, and Socrates had asked him, gently, to define his terms, and within 20 exchanges the bronze-smith did not know what courage was, though he had been certain of it a few minutes before, and a small crowd had gathered to watch a proud man's certainty come apart like a poorly made basket. Plato remembered feeling something close to cruelty in it, and also something close to the opposite, a fierce tenderness, because Socrates never laughed at the man, never postured, only kept asking, patient as a man teaching a child to walk, willing to fall down beside him as many times as it took. That was the thing later readers never seemed to understand about the dialogues, Plato thought. They read the arguments and missed the love inside them. Socrates had never wanted to win. He had wanted the other man to see. There was a difference, and it was the difference between philosophy and every other kind of talking. They had killed him for it anyway. 70 years old, and they gave him the hemlock because he had gone around Athens asking people what they meant by justice, and it turned out to be more dangerous than any army. Plato had been in the room. He did not write himself into that dialogue Phaedo except as an absence, a name mentioned once, sick and unable to attend. He had lied. He had been there. He had simply never been able to write what it was to watch it happen, the slow cold rising from the feet, Socrates observing his own death with the same calm curiosity he brought to every other subject, asking Crito to remember the debt of a rooster owed to Asclepius, as if dying were merely another occasion for tidiness, forgetting one's small accounts in order before moving on to a larger question. 60 years, Plato thought, and I have been trying to answer that afternoon ever since. Every dialogue is a letter to a dead man, asking him if I got it right. Master, Demetrios was still standing there, patient, used to these silences. Forgive me. I was in Athens 60 years ago. Plato shook his head slightly, as though shaking water from his ears, returning to the present the way a diver returns to the surface reluctantly, and gasping a little. Where was I? The Allegory. That it fails. That it does not fail, but is harder than I understood. He tapped his staff once against the ground, a habit, a kind of punctuation. When I was young I believed the true and the good were like the sun that once seen, they could not be unseen, could not be refused. I believed this because I had seen it happen to myself, watching Socrates. I mistook my own conversion for a law of nature. And now? Now I am 80, and I have watched 100 young men glimpse the sun and prefer the wall. Not because they are stupid. Some of the finest minds I have taught chose the wall. It is warmer there. Fewer people are angry with you. Your shadow keeps you good company. He thought, though he did not say it aloud, to Demetrios, of Dionysius of Syracuse. Twice Plato had sailed there, an old man risking a dangerous sea for the dream of a philosopher king, a tyrant's son who might be turned, with enough patient argument, into something better than his father. Twice he had failed. The second time they had very nearly sold him into slavery. A friend had bought him back at the market in Aegina, an indignity Plato still could not think of without a peculiar mixture of shame and dark amusement. The man who wrote the Republic nearly auctioned off like a jar of oil, save only because Anicetus happened to have the money and the affection to spend it. Dionysius had seen the fire. Plato was certain of that much. He had, for a season, genuinely wanted to be better than he was. And then the fire had proved inconvenient. It asked him to give up things, to be accountable to a friend rather than only to his own appetite, and he had gone back to the wall, and had Plato's own friend Dion murdered for the trouble of trying. That was the true ending the allegory needed, Plato thought. Not that the freed man returns to the cave to tell the others, and they kill him for disturbing their peace, though that was true enough, and had happened once already to the only teacher he had ever had. The truer, smaller tragedy was this, that a man could stand in the sun, could feel its warmth on actual skin, and still, of his own free will, turn around and walk back into the dark because the dark asked less of him. He had not understood at 40, when he wrote The Republic, that the will could refuse the good even after seeing it clearly. He understood it now. It had cost him a friend's life and 2 dangerous voyages, and something in himself he did not have a name for, a certain generosity toward human beings that had never quite grown back the way it was before. So Timon is right, Demetrios said carefully, that the freed man might reject the fire. Timon is more than right. Timon has found the sentence I would write differently if I were writing the Republic again. Plato's voice was mild, almost pleased, the way it always was when a flaw in his own work was found by someone he respected. I would keep the cave. I would keep the ascent, the pain of the eyes, the sun. But I would add one more scene, which I did not have wisdom enough to write at 40, the freed man standing at the mouth of the cave, fire behind him, sun ahead of him, and simply choosing wrongly, not from stupidity, not from being still chained, from something else, something I still do not have a clean word for, weakness perhaps, though that flatters it, or love of the familiar, even when the familiar is a wall of shadows one has made oneself and grown fond of, the way a man grows fond of an old wound. That's bleak, master. Is it? Plato considered this honestly, the way he considered most accusations against his own thought, turning it over like a coin to see the reverse. I don't think so. If the good pulled men by necessity, the way a stone falls, there would be no philosophy, only physics. It is precisely because a man can stand in the sunlight and still turn back that the ones who don't turn back are worth anything at all. Courage would mean nothing to a creature that could not run. The freed man who stays free, who comes back down into the cave anyway to argue badly with people who mostly do not want to hear him, and does it again the next day, and the day after that man is doing something difficult and real. I did not understand, at 40, that this was the harder and more interesting story. I thought the hard part was the climb. The hard part is staying. Demetrios was quiet a moment, turning that over. Then what do I tell Timon? Tell him he's right, and then ask him what he proposes to do about it. That is always the second question, and it is always the one people forget to ask. It is easy to notice that men prefer the wall. Only philosophy asks what you intend to do, knowing that. Demetrios bowed but did not leave right away. He shifted his weight, the particular fidget of a young man, with a second question he was not sure he was allowed to ask. Plato, who had spent 60 years learning to recognize that fidget in others, waited him out. Master, may I ask something that isn't about Timon? You may ask something that isn't about anything. That is generally when the good questions arrive. Are you afraid? Of dying, I mean. You speak of Socrates so calmly. I have always wondered whether that calm was real in him, or whether he performed it for Phaedo's sake and for yours. It was a bold question, and a good one, and Plato did not answer it quickly, which was itself a kind of answer. I have asked myself that for 60 years, he said finally, whether the calm was real. I think yes. I think it was real, though I do not think it came easily or came from nowhere. He had practiced dying his whole life, in a sense. Not morbidly. He simply never mistook the body for the man, and so the failing of the body was, for him, a kind of secondary matter, painful but not catastrophic, the way a scribe is inconvenienced but not ended by the breaking of his stylus. Plato looked down at his own hands, at the spots and the slight tremor that had not been there 10 years ago. As for myself, I am 80, Demetrios, and I find I am less afraid than I expected to be at 40, when I first tried to imagine this age, and more afraid than I expected to be at 60, when I thought I had already made my peace with it. Fear does not move in a straight line. It comes and goes like weather. Some mornings I wake and feel entirely ready, as though death were merely the last item on a long and reasonable list. Other mornings this morning, if I am honest, I feel a kind of grief for the dialogues I will not write, the arguments I will not finish, the version of the Republic I would write now, with Timon's objection folded into it, and Dion's murder folded into it, and everything else this long life has taught me that the young man who wrote it did not know. Does that grief frighten you? No. It only tells me I have not stopped loving this world, which seems to me a good sign, on the whole, in a man of 80. I would be more worried if I felt nothing. He was quiet again, watching a lizard cross the base of the fig tree in 3 quick pulses and a long stillness, the way lizards always moved, all urgency and then none. I will tell you something I have not told the others, Plato said. When I was younger than you, I wanted to be a poet. I wrote tragedies. I thought I might be good at it. And then I met Socrates, and I burned every poem I owned in the courtyard of my father's house because I had understood, all at once, that I had been in love with beautiful lies, and here was a man in love with ugly truths, and the ugly truths were better, though it took me years to be sure of that. Some days I am still not entirely sure of it. He smiled, not entirely a happy smile. So you must understand that when I write the myths at the end of the Republic, or the story of or the tale of Atlantis I gave to Timaeus, I am not a philosopher who occasionally permits himself a story. I am a poet who was persuaded at 17 by the strongest argument I have ever encountered that poetry alone could not be trusted, and who has spent every year since trying to build something that could hold both the poet and the augur at once without either one lying to the other. I do not know if I have succeeded. I suspect no one succeeds completely, but it is what the whole life has been for. I did not know that. About the poems. Almost no one does. It is not the kind of thing one puts in a dialogue. He straightened slightly, wincing at some complaint in his lower back that had become a familiar companion these last several winters. Go on, now. Timon is waiting, and it is bad pedagogy to keep an honest boy waiting too long. He will decide we are afraid of his question, and then he will be insufferable for a month. Demetrios laughed, bowed properly this time, and jogged back toward the plane trees where the argument was clearly still going, unresolved, the way all the good arguments in that garden always were. By design, Plato had built the academy to be a place where nothing was ever quite finished, because he had come, slowly, to distrust anything that called itself finished. He sat a while longer beneath his fig tree. The light had shifted. It fell now through the upper leaves in coins and arrows, moving very slightly with a wind he could not feel down at bench height. Somewhere past the gymnasium a group of younger boys were being drilled in geometry by a teacher whose name Plato, embarrassingly, could no longer quite call to mind. Memory had become a garden with sections gone suddenly to weeds, though the oldest parts, the agora, the bronze myth, Socrates' calm hands around the cup, remained as clear as if they had happened that morning. 80 years. He had outlived Socrates by 10 years already, would likely outlive him by more. He had written more dialogues than he could easily count, had built a school that would, he half suspected, outlive Athens itself, had sailed twice into a tyrant's court and come back once nearly a slave, had buried more friends than he wished to remember, and had one, Dion, murdered for believing in the same things Plato believed in. He had spent 60 years trying to answer one dead man's questions, and had arrived, in old age, mostly at better questions which he had once mistaken, in his youth, for a lesser achievement than answers. He no longer thought so. An answer closed a door. A better question kept it open a little longer, let more light in, however imperfect, however slanted with autumn. The afternoon went on. A servant brought bread and watered wine, which Plato ate slowly, watching a wasp investigate the rind and then abandon it, unimpressed, for somewhere better. Two older students, men in their 30s who had been with the academy since it was little more than a gymnasium and a rumor, came to sit near him for a while and speak of small matters, a disputed inheritance one of them was helping his brother settle, a new comet someone claimed to have seen over Piraeus, whether it was an omen or merely a comet, a question Plato answered by asking what evidence would distinguish the two, which was, he supposed, the only answer he had ever really given to anything, dressed in 100 different costumes over 60 years. He noticed, as the two men left, that one of them, the younger, Plato, a serious boy from Corinth who had come to the academy with almost nothing but a letter of introduction and a stubborn appetite for mathematics, had lingered a moment too long, glancing back before deciding against whatever he had meant to say and hurrying after his friend. Plato marked it the way he had learned to mark such things over the decades, not with alarm, but with the patient attention of a man who had watched enough young faces to know that most unspoken questions eventually came back around if you were still there to receive them. He did not have to wait long. Before the sun had moved another handspan across the garden wall, Plato returned alone, walking with the particular stiffness of someone who has rehearsed an opening sentence and is now discovering it does not fit in his mouth the way it fit in his head. "Master, I would not trouble you, but," he stopped. "You are already troubling me very little, and will trouble me less the sooner you say it." Plato exhaled. "My father wants me to come home. He says philosophy has fed me nothing but debts and strange opinions, and that a man of Corinth ought to be seeing to his family's oil trade rather than arguing about forms with strangers in Attica. He is not wrong that we need the money. I do not know how to answer him, because everything I would say sounds, in my father's house, exactly like what he already believes philosophers say: fine words, no bread." Plato studied the boy for a moment, the ink stains on his fingers that would not quite wash out, the way his eyes kept sliding toward the plane trees where the argument about the cave was still, distantly audible. "Do you love your father?" "Of course." "Then do not answer him with an argument. Arguments are for Timon, who wants to be persuaded and is only pretending to resist. Your father does not want to be persuaded. He wants to know his son will not starve, and that the strange opinions were worth the debts." Plato shifted the staff between his hands. "Tell me honestly, if you went home tomorrow to the oil trade, would you be miserable?" "Yes," Plato said, with no hesitation at all, which told Plato more than an hour of argument could have. "Then you already have your answer, and the only remaining question is how to give it to your father in a shape he can hold without cutting his hands on it. Go home for the season, since he is your father and that is owed. Bring him figures, not opinions, figures. Ask Theaetetus to help you set down some of the geometry that has practical use, the measuring of land, the calculation of a fair price, the kind of thing a man who sells oil actually needs and rarely gets from the men he pays to do his accounts. Show your father that philosophy did not enter your hands, whatever else it did. Let the return to Corinth itself be your argument. Words rarely change a father's mind. A son who comes home useful sometimes does." Plato looked for a moment as though something heavy had been set down. "And if he still asks me to stay?" "Then you will face a harder question than any Timon has asked this week, and you will have to decide, like every man eventually must, what you owe to those who made you and what you owe to what you have found on your own. I cannot answer that one for you. No dialogue I have written answers it, though I have tried more than once, in more than one disguise. I can only tell you that the asking of it, honestly, is itself a kind of philosophy, whatever your father calls it." The boy bowed, more moved than he seemed to want to show, and left more quickly than he had come, as young men often did once they had gotten what they needed and grown suddenly embarrassed at having needed it. Plato watched him go, and thought, not without a certain rueful amusement, that he had spent the morning discussing the hardest metaphysical question of his life's work with one student, and had spent the afternoon telling another to bring his father some figures about oil. Both, he decided, were philosophy. Perhaps this was the thing he had understood last of all, later even than the business of the wall refusing the good in full sunlight, that wisdom was not one substance poured into different cups depending on the occasion, grand for the Republic and small for a frightened boy from Corinth. It was the same attentiveness turned toward whatever stood in front of you, whether that was the nature of justice or a father's fear of an empty house. The sun began its long fall toward the western hills, and the gold light turned a deeper color, the color of the last good hour of any autumn day, and Plato thought, not for the first time, that he did not know how many more of these particular hours were left to him, and found that the thought today did not frighten him as much as it grieved him, which he had already told Demetrios was the better of the two feelings, and which he still believed, sitting here alone with the wasp gone and the wine gone and only the light left, moving slowly across the ground toward the wall of the garden, the way light always moved, toward the very thing it could not quite illuminate. It was into this stillness that Speusippus arrived, his nephew, a heavy-set man now well into his own middle years, who had long ago given up any pretense of romantic notions about philosophy and had instead become, over 2 decades, the one person in the academy who actually kept it running, the ledgers, the disputes over lodging, the endless small diplomacies required to keep 40 opinionated young men from setting the place on fire, literally or otherwise. Plato loved him with the particular gratitude one feels for a person who does the unglamorous work that makes the glamorous work possible. Uncle. Speusippus lowered himself onto the bench with a groan that suggested his knees had been complaining even before Plato's had started. I have been arguing with the estate of Philippos of Opus for 3 hours about a boundary wall, and I would like, for perhaps 10 minutes, to discuss anything other than boundary walls. Then let us discuss the cave. Timon believes freed prisoners would reject the fire. Timon believes a great many uncomfortable things and says most of them loudly. It is why I like him, though I would never tell him so, he would become unbearable. Speusippus rubbed his eyes. You look tired, uncle. I am 80. Tired is simply how the days feel now, the way one used to feel, or hungry. It is not alarming. It is only weather. I worry regardless. I know you do. It is one of the finer things about you, and one of the more exhausting. Plato said it with enough warmth that Speusippus laughed despite himself. Tell me instead what troubles you about the school, since that is plainly what you came to discuss, and the boundary wall was only your way of clearing your throat. Speusippus was quiet a moment, watching the light move on the wall. When you are gone, and I do not say this callously, only as a man responsible for accounts must say such things eventually, who leads the academy, you have never named a successor plainly. Everyone assumes it will be me, since I'm your nephew and I have kept the ledgers longest, but assumption is a poor foundation for an institution, and I would rather hear it from you than guess. It was, Plato recognized, the most practical question anyone had asked him all day, and also, in its way, the larger, perhaps, than Timon's objection to the allegory, because it was a question not about ideas but about what would become of the place where ideas were kept alive after the man who had planted the fig tree was no longer there to sit beneath it. I have thought about this more than you know, Plato said. And I will tell you honestly, since you have asked honestly, I believe it will be you, and I believe it should be you, not because you are my blood, though I do love you for that too, but because you are the one who understands that a school is not held together by brilliance. It is held together by patience, by ledgers kept honestly, by disputes over boundary walls settled fairly, by someone willing to do the unglamorous work of continuity while the rest of us chase the beautiful and difficult questions. Timon will never run this place, though he may be its greatest mind in a generation. He has no patience for boundary walls, and a school without someone who has patience for boundary walls collapses within 5 years, however brilliant its arguments. You have that patience. I have watched you exercise it for 20 years without once being thanked properly for it. Consider this, now, your thanks, inadequate as it is. Speusippus did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was rougher than before. That is more than I expected you to say. I am 80 and increasingly disinclined to leave the important things unsaid simply because saying them is uncomfortable. It is one of the few genuine advantages of old age. Shame loses some of its grip once you can see the end of things clearly enough. Say what is true while there is time to say it. That has become more and more the whole of my remaining philosophy. And the philosophy itself, the arguments, the dialogues, when I am the one keeping the school after you who decides what counts as faithful to your teaching and what does not. Aristotle argues with you more than any student I have known, openly, in front of the others. Some days I think he will end by rejecting half of what you have built. Plato smiled at this, and it was a real smile, unclouded. Good. Gog. Speusippus, if the boy accepted every word I said without argument, I would consider the school a failure, whatever else it achieved. I did not build the academy to produce men who repeat me. I built it to produce men who think as carefully as I tried to, which will sometimes mean thinking their way past me, the same way I thought my way past some of what Socrates believed, though I loved him more than I have loved almost any other person. If Aristotle argues himself into disagreeing with the theory of forms entirely, and does it with rigor, and does it honestly, I will consider that a greater monument to what we have built here than 100 students who simply nodded. Let him argue. Let him be right where I was wrong. That is not a threat to the school. That is the school working exactly as it should. Speusippus shook his head slowly, half in exasperation and half in something closer to awe, an expression Plato had seen on his nephew's face many times over the years, usually right before Speusippus went off to have the same conversation, considerably compressed with whichever student most needed to hear it. I will tell Aristotle you said that. He worries, I think, that his disagreements wound you. Tell him instead that agreement would wound me more. A student who never disagrees has stopped thinking and started merely admiring, and admiration is a pleasant thing to receive but a poor substitute for a mind actually working. I would rather be argued with by someone I respect than praised by 100 who have stopped looking closely enough to find anything worth arguing about. They sat together a while longer as the light thinned toward evening, speaking of smaller things now, the state of the roof over the east portico, which had begun to leak with the autumn rains, whether the school could afford another set of astronomical instruments. Eudoxus had requested a letter that had arrived from a former student now teaching in Assos, full of news, and Speusippus suspected a request for money disguised as news. Plato listened to all of it with the same unhurried attention he had given Timon's objection and Clatos's father, because he had come to believe more firmly with each passing year that there was no true division between the grand questions and the small ones, only a single continuous fabric of a life examined carefully, thread by unglamorous thread. Eventually Speusippus rose, brushing dust from his tunic, and paused before leaving. "Thank you, uncle, for the ledgers, and for what you said before the ledgers. Thank you for asking honestly, instead of guessing and resenting me later for a decision I never plainly made. That is a rarer gift than you know." Plato watched him go, a solid, unglamorous, indispensable shape moving off through the lengthening shadows toward whatever boundary dispute or leaking roof awaited him next, and felt, watching him, something very close to peace. He had not been alone long when a different shape crossed the garden toward him, quicker than Speusippus, more precise in its motion, a young man of perhaps 25, with the particular carriage of someone who had grown up wealthy and had never quite unlearned the habit of moving as though a room ought to arrange itself around him, though the academy, to its credit, had spent several years persuading him it would not. Aristotle of Stagira had arrived at the school 17 years old and full of certainties, and Plato had watched with the mixture of exasperation and delight peculiar to teaching the genuinely gifted, as the certainties had been worn down one by one, not into humility exactly. Aristotle would never quite manage humility, but into something better, a hunger that had learned to doubt itself just enough to keep working. "Master, Speusippus says you spoke of me." Speusippus talks a great deal for a man who claims to prefer ledgers. He said you called my disagreements a monument. Aristotle said this carefully, watching Plato's face the way he watched everything, cataloguing as if the whole world were a specimen he intended eventually to dissect and classify, and in classifying understand completely, a habit of mind Plato found by turns wonderful and faintly alarming, the way one might feel about a beautiful animal not yet fully tamed. I did say something of the kind, though I doubt he rendered it so grandly. Set. You have been standing in that posture of a man who has come to apologize for something he does not actually regret, and I would rather have the disagreement than the apology. Aristotle sat, though stiffly, on the very edge of the bench, as though sitting fully might commit him to something. I have been working on the theory of forms again. I do not think it survived close examination, master, and I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it to wound you. I did not imagine you said it to wound me. Say it because you think it is true. That is the only acceptable reason for saying anything in this garden, and have been since before you arrived. The forms are meant to explain why particular things share a nature, why this bed and that bed are both beds, despite being made of different wood by different hands. You say it is because both partake of the form of bed, existing separately perfectly, somewhere beyond the world the senses show us. But master, where is this form? Not in this garden, not in Athens, not anywhere the senses can reach, and yet you ask me to believe it is more real, not less, than the actual bed I slept on last night. I have come to think the nature of a thing is not floating apart from it in some separate realm, but is in the thing itself. Its form is how it is arranged, how its matter is organized toward its purpose, not a shadow cast from somewhere else entirely. A bed's bedness is in the bed. I do not need a second, truer bed, invisible, to explain the one under me. Plato listened to all of this with an attention so complete that Aristotle, who had delivered versions of this argument to other students and grown used to a certain glazing of the eyes partway through, found himself faltering slightly under it, and used to being heard so entirely rather than merely waited out. Go on, Plato said. You have not finished, and I would rather hear the whole shape of it before I answer any part. That is nearly the whole of it. Where you place the reality of a thing outside the thing in a separate perfect realm, I would place it inside the thing in its own particular arrangement and purpose. I do not deny that some universal nature of bedness makes all beds beds in some sense. I only deny that this nature must live somewhere else, in some heaven of forms, rather than being discoverable entirely by looking closely enough at beds themselves, and dogs, and men, and stars, one at a time, patiently, the way Speusippus keeps his ledgers. Plato was quiet for a long moment, and the quiet stretched long enough that Aristotle began, despite himself, to worry that he had finally gone too far, that some line existed after all, invisible until crossed, and that he had just found it in front of the one man in Athens whose good opinion he had never quite stopped wanting, however much he told himself philosophy required indifference to any opinion, including the teacher's. I am not offended, Plato said finally, as though reading this directly off the boy's face, which perhaps he was 80 years had made him fluent in the particular anxious stillness of a student who feared he had wounded someone he respected. I want to say that first, plainly, because I remember how it felt to fear I had wounded Socrates with an honest disagreement, and I do not wish you to carry that fear a moment longer than necessary. Now, your argument is a serious one, and I will not pretend I can dismantle it in an afternoon beneath a fig tree, nor that I am entirely certain I disagree with as much of it as my younger self would have insisted. But I will offer you this, and you may do with it what your own thinking requires. When you say the nature of a bed is in the bed, discoverable by looking closely at beds, I ask you, by what standard do you judge one bed better made than another, sturdier, truer to its purpose? You are already, in that judgment, measuring the actual bed against something the actual bed does not fully achieve. Where does that standard lie, if not somewhere beyond any particular bed you have yet examined? In the purpose of the bed itself, in what a bed is for, which we can discover by observing what beds do, not by positing an invisible perfect bed elsewhere. Perhaps. I do not say you are wrong, Aristotle, only that I am not yet persuaded you are entirely right, and I suspect neither of us will be fully satisfied by this conversation, which I consider a mark in its favor rather than against it. Go on thinking it through all the way, wherever it leads you, even if it leads you to a system with no forms in my sense at all, resting entirely on the patient examination of particular things arranged by their own purposes. I would rather you build something true and different than something borrowed and half believed. Aristotle looked at him for a long moment, something working behind the careful, cataloguing eyes. You are not troubled that I might end by rejecting the center of your whole philosophy? I am 80 years old, and I have watched enough of my own certainties from 40 soften and shift and occasionally break entirely under the weight of things I did not understand until they had already cost me something. I would be a poor teacher and a worse philosopher if I demanded of you an immunity to that same process. Build your system, Aristotle. Examine every bed and every star and every creature that swims or crawls or flies, the way I have watched you already begin to do, with a patience I never quite had for the particular, preferring as I always have the pattern behind it. Perhaps between the two of us, one chasing the pattern and one chasing the particular thing, something more complete gets built than either of us could manage alone. That would not trouble me. That is very nearly the best outcome I could imagine for this garden. The light had gone properly grey now, the blue of true evening beginning to gather at the garden's edges, and Aristotle rose, slower than he had sat, as though something in him had shifted its weight during the conversation and needed a moment to find its new balance. Thank you, master. Thank you for the argument, which was better made than you perhaps know, and which I intend to think about for however many evenings remain to me. That is not nothing from an old man running short on evenings. It is, in fact, rather a great deal. Aristotle bowed and walked back toward the plane trees with the particular quickness of a young man whose mind has already run ahead of his feet toward the next page he intends to write, and Plato watched him go, thinking that of all the strange gifts a long life had given him, this was among the strangest and best to be disagreed with thoroughly and rigorously by a mind he suspected might eventually surpass his own, and to feel, watching that mind walk away to do exactly that, nothing but a kind of fierce, unqualified pride. A boy's voice rose above the others under the plane trees. Timmons, unmistakably, still arguing, still refusing to be satisfied, which was, Plato thought, watching the fig-leaf light move across the backs of his own spotted hands, exactly what he had built this whole garden for. He did not get up right away. There would be time. There was, he had found, almost always more time than a young man expects, and never quite as much as an old one hopes for, and somewhere in the honest space between those two mistaken certainties was where a person actually had to live and think and choose the fire or the wall again and again for as many days as were given to him. Eventually, though, he did rise, because he had never yet, in 80 years, found a good argument for staying seated when a student wanted an answer, and he did not intend to start now. He crossed the garden slowly, staff tapping the packed earth, toward the noise beneath the plane trees, where a dozen young faces turned at once to watch him come, the way sunflowers turn, without quite meaning to, toward whatever light is available to them, and Plato, walking toward them, thought that this, more than any dialogue, more than any form or forge of argument he had ever built, was probably the truest thing he had made in this long life, not a doctrine, but a garden full of people still willing to turn. He sat with them as the light went gold and then rose-colored and then, slowly, grey. Timon rose to meet him halfway, a wiry, restless young man with the particular energy of someone who had been rehearsing an argument for hours and could barely contain it any longer, and did not wait for the customary courtesies before launching in. Master, Demetrius says you agree with me that the freed man might choose the wall, but if that is true, then what is the Republic even for? If men can see the good and still refuse it, then all your talk of education, of the philosopher king, of arranging the city so that men are led properly toward the sun, what use is any of it if the will can simply say no at the last moment regardless? It was, Plato thought, exactly the right second question, the one that followed necessarily from the first, and he felt something like satisfaction at hearing it asked so cleanly, even as the light continued its long fall toward evening and his own body reminded him, in a dozen small aches, how late in his own particular day it had become. Tell me, Timon, when a farmer plants wheat, does he guarantee the harvest? No. Weather can ruin it. Blight can ruin it. And does the farmer therefore refuse to plant? Timon paused, seeing where this was headed and characteristically refusing to simply accept it without testing its weight first. No, but the farmer's planting increases the odds of a harvest. You are saying education increases the odds a man chooses rightly without guaranteeing it. I am saying exactly that, and I will go further. I think this is not a weakness in the argument for education, but very nearly the whole of its dignity. If education guaranteed virtue the way heat guarantees the melting of wax, there would be no virtue in it at all, only mechanism. It is precisely because the freed man retains, even after every advantage of teaching and sunlight, the terrible freedom to turn back toward the wall, that his choosing rightly means anything at all. The city I described in the Republic does not exist to eliminate that freedom. It exists to make the choosing of the sun as undistorted, as clearly seen, as possible, to remove the false weights that make the wall look heavier with comfort than it is, and the sun look harsher with difficulty than it need be. Beyond that, the choice remains the man's own all the way down, and no city, however well arranged, can walk that last step for him. Timon considered this for a long moment, and Plato watched something shift in the boy's face, not defeat, which Timon rarely showed and which Plato would have found disappointing if he had, but the particular reorganizing that happened when a mind found a place to set an objection down without abandoning it, folding it into something larger rather than discarding it. Then I withdraw nothing, Timon said finally, but I add that the Republic should perhaps say this more plainly than it does. You leave a reader thinking education is closer to a guarantee than you apparently believe it to be. You are very likely right, and if I live long enough, and Speusippus does not overrule me on grounds of my failing memory, I may yet revise the passage. Plato said this lightly, but meant it the way he had come to mean most things he said lightly, having learned that gravity announced too loudly tended to convince no one, while lightness worn easily over a serious point often let it slip further in. Write down your objection precisely as you have made it tonight in your own hand, and give it to Speusippus for the school's records. Whatever becomes of me, that objection should not become of nothing. It is too good to be lost simply because its author was younger than its target. Timon looked, for the first time that evening, entirely without his usual armor of restless argument, simply pleased, in the plain and unguarded way of a young man who has been told his thinking mattered by someone whose good opinion he had not admitted, even to himself, how badly he wanted. The evening deepened around them, the grey light giving way finally to the blue that came before true dark, and one by one the students drifted off toward their quarters, toward supper, toward the ordinary businesses of young men with tomorrow still stretched comfortably ahead of them, unhurried, unrationed. Plato remained beneath the plane trees a while longer, and then, slowly, made his way back toward his own rooms, past the fig tree, past the gate with its inscription about geometry, the staff tapping its familiar rhythm against the darkening path. He thought, walking, of Socrates and of Dion, and of the poems he had burned as a young man in his father's courtyard, and of Plato's on his way home to Corinth with a satchel of practical geometry meant to soften a father's disappointment, and of Speusippus somewhere still awake over his ledgers, and of Aristotle already, no doubt, sharpening a stylus to write down an argument that might one day make half of what Plato had built, faithfully keeping account of a school that would, Plato was now nearly certain, outlast every one of them. He thought that he had spent 60 years trying to answer one dead man's questions and had ended this particular evening mostly satisfied to have helped a handful of living men sharpen their own Demetrios and Timon, Platos and Speusippus and Aristotle, most of all, walking off into an evening that would, in ways Plato could not see and would not live to witness, belong far more to that quick cataloguing mind than to his own. An answer closed a door. A better question kept it open a little longer, let more light in, however imperfect, however slanted with autumn, however far the sun had already fallen toward the hills by the time an old man, leaning on his staff, finally turned and made his slow way home.